This presentation is entitled The Grieving Process, an important discussion as you prepare to serve Tamarisk families. I believe you will discover that you will often encounter grief caused not only by the death of a loved one, which we think of more naturally in connection with grief and will initiate the end of Tamarisk services many times, but what is called anticipatory grief, as the patient, their caregiver and family, and even yourself experience losses along the way, and as each of you come to terms with the end of life that will most often be the end result for the families that Tamarisk serves. As the subtitle suggests, a healthy resolution of any grieving process is to be able to make some meaning out of the loss, the smaller losses that the ill person and their family encounter, and also the idea of that final loss. Your journey is easier if one comes to a place of peace, where life continues to work and to make sense. In this presentation, we'll cover some basic concepts and help you apply this as you consider grief caused by losses in your own life, in the lives of the patients you care for, and also the losses that their caregivers and families will experience. During our training event, we will continue to discuss grief, so please make note of any questions, comments, or reflections that you'd like to share or process with the group. Finally, as you go through this lesson, please follow your printout of the PowerPoint. Be ready to pause the presentation at times in order to complete some of your own reflections on losses and grief in your own life. These reflections are an important part of your own preparation, so please be sure to complete them as we will talk about these things as a group. So, grief is the term applied to the process we go through in adapting to a loss. There are many different kinds of losses that we all experience, and we will talk about them in this presentation. A few words in this definition and helpful quote that I'd like to call attention to. First, grief is natural. It is normal and healthy to experience all the emotions associated with grief. Second, grief is a process. Processing the emotions that we experience due to loss take time. Depending upon the type of loss, we may grieve for a moment or for a lifetime. There is no set, correct time frame that applies to everyone. Third, grief is a process of discovery. I like this word, as it lets you know that there is work to be done, something you can do about your grief, and it also gives a positive perspective to the journey. The three key words in this quote give important content to the work of grieving process. We must acknowledge that something's been lost. It will not be uncommon for you as you serve families to find it hard at times for people to face the things that they are losing along the way. Healing begins when we're able to focus on and appreciate what is left. Our role as a volunteer can sometimes be to help people discover the good that still remains. And finally, life can continue to hold meaning when we can integrate the loss and to see the possibilities of good things in the days ahead. We all experience various kinds of losses throughout our lives, both large and small. Here is a general list categorizing the kinds of losses, some that you may not have considered before as you think of grief. We all experience grief when we lose someone special to us, whether through death or the end of a relationship, but you'll also experience grief in other ways. I recall lamenting over the fact that I needed reading glasses and was upset about it for a time. You may recall crying over, as a child, losing your favorite toy. These are very real expressions of grief, and each of these smaller experiences can help us prepare for and cope for those times when a loss is overwhelming. Now at this time, I'd like you to pause the presentation or even stop for a while in order to reflect on your own experiences of loss, of grief, and how you may or may not approach the idea of death with fear or trepidation. Now this might be a difficult exercise for some, so please feel free to take it at your own pace, or even to choose not to address something that's difficult at this time. It is important for us as we volunteer to be aware of our own experience of grief so that we can empathize and even connect well with those we are helping. And your reflections will be helpful as we continue the presentation. So again, at this time, please pause or stop the presentation to complete two worksheets that are listed here. The personal loss inventory and also the death anxiety exercise. You will find them in your training binder. Welcome back. I hope these 2 exercises have been helpful for you and that you can see many examples from your life of how you've experienced loss, worked through the emotions, whether large or small, and have been able to find new meaning and joy in life. Well, as we've already said, grieving is a process. You may be familiar here with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work in counseling the grieving and her listing of these 5 stages of grief that she found many of her clients experienced. Now, my intent in Tamarisk training is not for you to necessarily memorize these stages or try to fit your own experience of grief into an expected mold, but to help you to be aware of some common experiences that are part of the process. So I've also included another helpful listing of what many experience. Now, as you look at these 2 lists, take a moment to make note on your notes page ways that you have experienced these stages of grief, and perhaps some that you may have not. The patients and families that you work with may experience a range of these emotions as they encounter losses due to their illness. Being aware of your own pattern of grief can help you recognize this in others and prepare you to be a good listener and supporter. It can also prepare you to be ready to work with someone through a grief process, so you can give them guidance and point them toward healing and resolution of their grief. Now, no matter what stage of grief one may be experiencing as they go through the process, it is also important to note that these emotions will take place in connection with and in the context of everyday life. So in this slide, I've included some examples. First, from the inner world, or you may say, the intangible side of life. The grieving process takes place in our feelings for sure, but also in some very practical ways. For instance, you see roles listed here. A very common loss that our families must deal with is adjusting to the fact that the ill person can no longer work, no longer take care of the children, no longer manage the finances. You can fill in the blanks, I am sure, with ways you or someone you know has had to adjust for those types of losses. The grieving process also includes the outer world. Things or activities that have normally been a part of life, but are now gone or need to change. Most of us are familiar with how holidays change after a loved one passes. For families that Tamarisk serves, this change is likely already beginning, as the ill person perhaps cannot travel anymore, or may not be able to interact or participate in family activities the way they used to. So once again, take a moment and even pause the presentation if you'd like, to consider how you or someone you know has experienced the inner and the outer world of grief as they've gone through the stages of the grieving process. Perhaps make note of a story that you can share with the group, or a question you have for any of these examples that might not be clear to you. Now, these last few slides of this presentation are hopefully very practical. Recall at the start that we highlighted that grieving is a process, and that it's a process of discovery. The implication here that I believe gives all of us hope and help is that there are things that we can do. That grieving is not merely a jumble of emotions that happen to us, but instead that it's a work to be accomplished and in some ways completed. Now, the title here is The Tasks of Grieving. Seeing the process of grief as having a beginning and an end that one can take steps to work through helps to make it manageable, especially when the loss is overwhelming. We will list 4 tasks, 4 things you can do in order to work through the process of grief and come to a place where life has meaning, where you've been able to discover what is possible. Well, first, some thoughts about these tasks. These tasks imply that the grieving person needs to take action, that they can do something. These tasks imply that the grieving can be influenced by intervention from the outside. That it's essential that the grieving person accomplish these tasks before mourning can be completed. And finally, the tasks imply that uncompleted grief tasks can impair further growth and development. So let's take a look at these 4 tasks. The first one is to accept the reality of the loss. Now, this may seem like an obvious comment, perhaps an easy step in the process for a smaller loss. But when the loss is overwhelming, you may find that this is hard for some. If you compare this step to the list of the stages of grief, the experience of shock or denial expresses this part of the grieving process. Of course, one must come to grips with the reality of a loss before any further work or progress in the healing process of grief can occur. The second task in the grieving process is to work through the pain of grief. Again, in the stages, you see examples of this as anger, depression, hostility, crying, withdrawal, expressions of or allowing yourself to experience whatever emotions come your way is healthy and important. It's often been said that one needs to allow these feelings to pass over you like a wave. And the third task, to adjust an environment in which the deceased or other type of loss is missing. Now, this includes the types of adjustments that refer to the inner and outer worlds we already discussed. They're seen in the stages as that final step of acceptance, healing of memories, and discovering one's new role in life. The fourth task is to emotionally relocate the deceased or the lost and to move on with life. Now, we often encourage others to find ways to cherish the memory of one who's passed away or to, quote, keep them alive by honoring them in some way. With other types of losses, this could mean, for example, finding a new sense of purpose or identity when you're no longer able to work and the career that has defined you and who you are is gone. Now, finally, this last comment is helpful in that we must always be aware that as volunteers, we cannot take our families through the grieving process by our own efforts. It might be uncomfortable at times to wait with someone who's in shock or angry about the loss they experience. However, our role can be to help them as they go through the process of grief. Our own understanding of what's normal and what tasks need to be accomplished can be of great help to them as they take their own journey. Finally, some clarifying thoughts about these 4 tasks. First of all, it's important to note that they are not listed in any order of occurrence. You may not have a hard time accepting the reality of a loss and simply skip that step. Or you might be able to make external adjustments and then later go through a time of emotional grieving. The order isn't what's important, but the tasks are accomplished. Second, these tasks can be revisited and reworked over time. It's important to note, and it might be a helpful thought for your families at times, as there should come a day when the hardest work of grief is completed, but that doesn't mean that you'll never again experience sadness or a moment of grief over the loss again. Various tasks can be worked on at the same time. And finally, grieving is a fluid process again. So please don't take this discussion with its lists of stages and tasks to mean that grieving is a prescribed path with easily marked steps along the way. Each of us will definitely experience it differently. Now, my hope in this discussion is that you've gained a better understanding of the experience of grief in your own life and as a process in general, and that this understanding will equip you to walk alongside the families we serve as a caring presence that understands, listens, lightens the load, and perhaps points the way towards healing.